Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really critical scenario, something that demands serious thought.
Absolutely.
What actually happens if China invades Taiwan and then the U.S. responds not just by defending Taiwan, but with direct military attacks on mainland China?
Yeah.
This isn't just, a war game scenario. Our sources are clear. This would be the first direct war between superpowers in decades. The implications are, profound, global. So for this deep dive, we're going to unpack it all. The military side, the economic chaos, the political shifts, and the human cost, if that line gets crossed. Because, and this isn't hyperbole, the entire world changes if that happens.
It really does. And that's why understanding this potential chain reaction is just so vital for you listening right now, the scale of the impact. It's not like conflicts we've seen recently.
How so?
Well, think about it. We've seen regional wars, sure, and they have global effects. But a direct fight between two nuclear-armed superpowers. With today's interconnected economy, it's a fundamentally different beast.
Much more complex than even the Cold War standoffs.
Arguably, yes. Because of that deep global integration, it's not just a military clash, it's a potential reordering of everything. Global power, the economy, our daily lives.
Okay, let's walk through it then. How does this whole catastrophic sequence kick off, according to the sources? It starts with China invading Taiwan, right? A full-scale invasion. What does that actually look like?
Right. It would likely begin with a massive amphibious assault. Forces moving from China's eastern coast, think Fujian, Guangdong, provinces right across the Taiwan Strait. Those are the logical launch pads.
Okay, boots on the ground, or rather ships in the water.
Exactly. But simultaneously, you'd see missile barrages hitting key targets like Taipei. And massive cyber attacks trying to knock out Taiwan's government systems, its power grid, critical infrastructure.
Trying to paralyze them from the start.
Precisely. And add to that a naval blockade. Cut off the island, stop trade, stop any potential aid getting in by sea. Isolate them completely.
So Taiwan is under attack. What's the U.S. doing in this scenario? The sources say they don't just defend Taiwan.
Yeah, that's the crucial part for this deep dive. The initial U.S. moves would be predictable to an extent. Deploying carrier strike groups, those huge naval forces with aircraft carriers at their core.
Projecting power.
Right. Activating Pacific Air Command. Issuing final warnings to Beijing. But then comes the escalation. The U.S. doesn't just intercept missiles aimed at Taiwan or help the Taiwanese military. It actually launches strikes against targets inside mainland China.
That is a huge step. Why? What's the rationale in the sources for the U.S. taking that massive risk hitting the mainland?
The thinking, as laid out in the materials we looked at, is that China's military infrastructure on the mainland, the air bases launching the planes, the radar systems guiding missiles, the missile sites themselves aren't just support.
They're part of the attack itself.
Exactly. They're seen as integral to the assault on Taiwan. So hitting those targets is, from this perspective, hitting the source of the attack. And that's the moment the U.S. is fully, officially, in a direct war with China.
Not a proxy war anymore.
No, direct superpower conflict.
And the sources suggest that once that line is crossed, things escalate incredibly fast, like almost immediately.
That's the analysis. Within hours, the situation could spiral. One defense analyst we read literally said Asia would be on fire.
On fire. Wow. What does that mean in terms of military action? What gets hit first?
Well, think about the U.S. perspective. The priority targets inside China would likely be those airfields in Fujian and Guangdong that we mentioned, the ones launching fighters and bombers towards Taiwan.
Take out the launch pads.
Right. Also, naval ports being used for the invasion fleet. Key missile silos, especially those capable of hitting U.S. bases or ships. And command and control centers probably targeted with cyber warfare too, to try and blind and confuse the Chinese military command.
Okay, so the U.S. strikes key military infrastructure in China. China's not just going to sit there, though. What's their likely retaliation?
Absolutely not. Retaliation would be swift and symmetrical in intent, if not necessarily in kind. You expect missile strikes aimed at U.S. bases in the region. Guam is a major hub. Bases in Japan, definitely. Maybe even horrifyingly as far as Hawaii.
Hawaii, that's U.S. soil.
It is, and the threat potential is there. Plus, massive cyber attacks against U.S. infrastructure. Think power grids, financial systems, communication networks, aiming for maximum disruption.
Crippling the U.S. homeland.
That would be the goal. And militarily, blocking the South China Sea, That shuts down a huge chunk of global shipping instantly. And some sources even mention potential attacks on satellites, commercial ones, GPS, communications, things we utterly rely on.
Satellites, too. This sounds unlike any war fought before.
That's a key point. The level of technology involved would be staggering.
One source called it potentially the most sophisticated military conflict ever. What makes it so different? What kind of tech are we talking about?
Well, you're looking at things like hypersonic missiles. These aren't just faster. They can maneuver unpredictably within the atmosphere.
Making them really hard to shoot down.
Extremely hard. Existing missile defenses might be almost useless.
Yeah.
Then you have artificial intelligence playing a huge role maybe in targeting and coordinated defenses, even potentially in drone swarms.
Drone swarms, like hundreds or thousands of drones acting together.
Exactly. Designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers and coordinated attacks. And don't forget orbital warfare, fighting for control of space, for satellites, for communication and surveillance dominance. It's multi-domain warfare on a level we haven't seen.
Hypersonics, AI, drone swarms, space. It's almost science fiction, but it's the reality of modern military tech. The speed of decision-making required.
Right. Think about the ODO loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. That loop would be compressed to milliseconds. The pressure on commanders, the reliance on automated systems, it's immense. A terrifying evolution, really.
Okay, let's shift gears. Because beyond the terrifying military clash, the economic fallout, it's almost unimaginable if you thought COVID disrupted the economy.
Oh, COVID would look like a minor blip compared to this.
Yeah.
The economic impact would be immediate, global, and absolutely brutal.
What happens first?
Stock markets worldwide wouldn't just dip, they'd crash instantly. We're talking panic selling on a scale never seen before. And think about the hidden risks like derivatives markets. They could amplify the shock way beyond even 2008. Credit could freeze globally.
And the supply chains? Taiwan is central to semiconductors, right?
Absolutely central. The most advanced chips, mostly made in Taiwan, that supply chain gets wiped out overnight. Think about what that means. Cars, phones, computers, medical equipment, servers. Everything grinds to a halt.
So massive shortages everywhere.
Massive, unprecedented. And oil prices, with shipping lanes blocked, especially in Asia, and general war panic, sources suggest oil could easily spike above $200 a barrel, maybe much higher.
$200 a barrel, that ripples through everything. Food prices, transportation.
Everything. It would trigger a global recession almost instantly. Potentially a full-blown depression, worse than the 1930s, given how interconnected we are now.
Okay, let's zoom in on the U.S. specifically. What are the direct economic hits for America?
Huge losses. Think about major American companies, Apple, Tesla, Nike, countless others, heavily reliant on manufacturing in China or selling to the massive Chinese market. That access disappears overnight. Poof, gone.
Trillions in market value evaporated.
Easily. And then there's the cost of the war itself. The U.S. would have to borrow unimaginable amounts of money, adding rocket fuel to the existing national debt crisis.
While tax revenues are plummeting because the economy's crashing.
Exactly. A vicious cycle. And the shortages we mentioned, they paralyze U.S. industries. Tech, manufacturing, even basic consumer goods. It hits every sector.
And what about China's economy? It's heavily export-driven, too.
China's economy would essentially collapse overnight as well.
Yes.
Its links to the global market would be severed. But and this is a key difference the sources point out. Beijing has tools of control that are much more extreme.
What do you mean?
They could impose nationwide rationing of food, fuel, essentials. Implement martial law to control the population and suppress dissent. It would be incredibly harsh for the average Chinese citizen.
And foreign companies still operating in China?
Huge risk. Beijing might just nationalize foreign assets in retaliation. Seize factories, investments, everything owned by companies from the U.S. or its allies.
Wow. So they could just take over a Ford plant or an Intel facility?
Potentially, yes, as an act of economic warfare. Which brings up a really critical point for you listening. How does all this chaos affect the supply chains you depend on every single day?
Right. It's not just about iPhones. It's about everything. Medical supplies, food imports, basic components for manufacturing.
Exactly. Think about it. Those rare earth minerals needed for electronics, mostly processed in China, gone. Active pharmaceutical ingredients for many common drugs, often made in China, cut off. It creates a global manufacturing standstill.
Far worse than the pandemic bottlenecks.
Far, far worse. Because it's not just a temporary disruption, it's a fundamental break.
Right.
And amid all this economic devastation, we have to remember the human cost. That's ultimately the most important and most tragic part.
Absolutely. Let's talk about that, the human toll, starting in Taiwan itself. What would happen to the people there?
It would be a humanitarian catastrophe. Our sources describe bombed cities, infrastructure destroyed. Think hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people displaced internally, fleeing the fighting.
Refugees.
Yes, potentially huge refugee flows, trying to get to nearby places like Japan or the Philippines, if they even could with the blockade. It's a horrifying picture.
And on mainland China, even if U.S. strikes are aimed at military targets.
Civilian casualties are almost inevitable, especially if military sites are located near populated areas. Plus, imagine the internal situation. Widespread panic, intense government censorship trying to control the narrative, potential food shortages due to rationing.
And civil unrest. If the war drags on or goes badly for Beijing.
A definite risk, according to the sources, especially if the economic hardship bites deeply or casualties mount. It could severely test the Communist Party's grip.
What about the impact on U.S. and allied military personnel and their families?
The cost would be immense. Significant losses of life in incredibly intense air and naval battles across the Pacific. The psychological toll on survivors. And think of the families back home. Decades of war in the Middle East have already strained military families. This would be on another level entirely.
And the fear back home, too. Cyber attacks, blackouts.
Yes, a pervasive fear. The possibility, however remote, of actual missile strikes hitting U.S. territory. It would change the sense of security fundamentally.
And broadening out again the global impact. How does this fear translate worldwide?
You'd see widespread panic. Nuclear anxiety would spike globally. Remember the Cold War drills? Cities might go on high alert again. International air travel would likely grind to a halt in many regions due to safety concerns and blocked airspace.
So it's not just the combatants affected. The fear, the disruption, it touches everyone, everywhere.
Absolutely. It becomes a global crisis, affecting daily life far beyond the actual fighting. The uncertainty alone would be crippling.
This kind of war doesn't just reshape battlefields and economies. It fundamentally changes global politics. Let's look at the political shockwaves. Starting with the U.S., how does this play out domestically?
Immense pressure on the president, whoever it is. Their leadership would be under a microscope, globally and domestically. You could see pushes for expanded war power.
Or huge backlash.
Exactly. The sources suggest a potentially deep divide opening up in the U.S. Pro-war hawks demanding total commitment versus anti-war voices, maybe populist ones, demanding withdrawal or negotiation. It could get very ugly politically.
And inside China, how does this affect Xi Jinping and the Communist Party's power?
It's a high-stakes gamble for them. If the war goes well, Xi could consolidate power even further, rallying nationalist sentiment. But if it goes badly,
what happens then?
He could face serious internal challenges, maybe from within the party, maybe from the public if the costs become too high. The sources talk about the risk of internal revolt, or even, in an extreme scenario, a revolution, if the party is seen to fail catastrophically.
So massive instability either way is possible.
Definitely. And the party would likely react by tightening control even further, more censorship, more surveillance, cracking down hard on any dissent.
Okay, so the internal politics of both giants are in turmoil. What about the rest of the world? How do other countries react? Alliances like NATO?
NATO would face enormous pressure. The U.S. would expect support, but European nations might be deeply divided about getting involved in a war with China, especially given the economic consequences for them. It could strain the alliance severely.
What about other major players? India? Russia?
India is interesting. It has its own tensions with China. A war might push it firmly into the Western camp strategically. Russia. Well, the sources suggest Russia might see an opportunity.
To do what? Support China?
Potentially. Or at least use the chaos to pursue its own interests while the U.S. is distracted. It could deepen the global divide, creating clear U.S.-led and China-Russia-led blocs.
And the global south, developing nations.
They'd be hit incredibly hard. Food shortages, energy price spikes, lack of access to technology. They often suffer the most from superpower conflicts, caught in the economic and political crossfire. It'd be devastating for them. So when you pull all these threads together, the military escalation, the economic collapse, the human suffering, the political earthquakes, what's the bigger picture? What really happens if the U.S. and China go to war over Taiwan?
It sounds like utter catastrophe.
That's what the sources point towards. The potential collapse of the entire globalized economy we've known for decades. The end of that interconnected world, perhaps.
Replaced by what? Regional blocs? Chaos?
Hard to say, but definitely something less stable, less prosperous. Add to that massive civilian casualties, a humanitarian crisis dwarfing anything recent, the potential rise of authoritarianism globally as countries clamp down. And always, lurking in the background?
The nuclear risk.
The nuclear risk. Even if it starts conventionally, escalation to nuclear use is a terrifying possibility in a direct war between these powers.
It's a chilling thought and brings us back to a really sobering conclusion from our sources. In a conflict like this, there might not be any real winner, just survivors, picking up the pieces of a broken world.
Exactly.
Something profound for all of us to think about regarding the future of global power, stability, and what lines should never be crossed.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Imagine this scenario for a moment. What if China actually invades Taiwan? And then the U.S. president orders strikes, not just near Taiwan, but on mainland China itself. It's a hypothetical, right? Something nobody really wants to see happen. But it is being discussed in policy circles, online, everywhere. And the specific reason we're doing this deep dive now, well, it stems from these recent reports. There's leaked audio, apparently, where former President Trump privately warned Xi Jinping. The warning was pretty blunt. If Taiwan were attacked, the U.S. would, quote, bomb the S out of Beijing. Now, publicly, his administration stuck to that sort of strategic ambiguity we've seen for years. But these private comments, they suggest something radically different, a much more direct line. So that's our mission today, to really explore the potential shocks, political, military, global, economic, that this specific scenario could set off. We've looked at a whole range of sources here: The Sun, The Times, Newsweek, Time, Axios, Business Insider, some analysis from the Council on Foreign Relations too. Basically trying to give you a shortcut to getting your head around this really complex potential future. To understand the weight of a threat like that, we kind of have to start with the history, right? The U.S. policy towards Taiwan, it's always been this careful tightrope walk.
That's right. Between what they call strategic ambiguity and explicit deterrence.
Strategic ambiguity being, we don't really say for sure if we defend Taiwan militarily.
Exactly. It's meant to deter China from attacking, but also, keep Taiwan from declaring independence unilaterally, which could provoke Beijing.
While explicit deterrence would be just laying it out, yes, we will defend Taiwan.
A really delicate balance, and often debated, as you can imagine. And that's what makes these alleged private comments from Trump so striking. They just completely blow past that ambiguity.
Yeah.
The reports, especially from sources like The Sun and The Times, they suggest he wasn't subtle about it in private fundraisers, openly claiming he'd told Xi, essentially, invade Taiwan and we bomb Beijing.
Wow. So not a hint, but a direct threat, at least in those settings. Which brings us to the crucial question here. Is this just Trump being Trump, bluster, bravado? Or is it actually a calculated deterrence strategy? Maybe something like the old madman theory?
Well, one policy analyst we read described it as this kind of push-pull strategy meets political theater. The madman theory, that's where a leader acts, or pretends to act, unpredictably, even irrationally. The idea is to make your adversary think you might actually do something extreme, something self-damaging even, and that deters them.
Okay.
But the absolute critical question is, does China actually believe this threat?
Right.
Do they see it as real intent, or just, playing to a domestic audience back home? Because how Beijing perceives it changes their entire calculus.
Okay, but let's say the threat doesn't work.
Yeah.
Or it's made and China moves anyway.
Yeah.
What are the hard military realities then? China's military buildup has been massive. What do sources like Time and Newsweek say about their actual invasion capabilities?
They're substantial. Across the board, really naval power, amphibious assault capability, air power, and definitely cyber warfare too. They've invested heavily.
But amphibious assaults.
Yeah.
Those are notoriously difficult, aren't they?
Oh, incredibly so. Probably the most complex type of military operation. You need near-perfect coordination, air, sea, land. Very, very hard to pull off successfully, especially on a large scale like invading Taiwan would require.
Okay, so that's one side. What about the U.S. response options? What do the Times of Israel or the Sun suggest there?
Equally comprehensive, you'd expect. We're talking major naval deployments into the region, advanced air defense systems, and of course, significant cyber operations, both defensive and potentially offensive, to disrupt China's command and control.
But here's where it gets really dicey. The scenario we started with, U.S. strikes on Beijing, that moves things into a totally different realm, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It risks immediate direct confrontation with a nuclear power.
Exactly. It's a huge escalation, a total game changer. We're not just talking conventional warfare anymore.
This is uncharted territory. Terrifying, really.
Yeah. One defense analyst in our sources put it very bluntly, something like, a strike on Beijing is a strategic blow, but carries huge escalation risks.
And those risks, what do they entail specifically?
Well, obviously retaliatory strikes, maybe on U.S. bases, ships, allies in the region. But the biggest fear, the ultimate risk, is that it triggers rapid nuclear escalation on both sides, spiraling into something truly catastrophic, something that could fundamentally reshape the entire global order.
And a conflict like this wouldn't just be happening over there. What about the impact here in the U.S. domestically? Public opinion seems kind of mixed, right? Sources like Reddit threads and Council on Foreign Relations polling show, well, most Americans don't love sending troops overseas generally.
That's true. There's a kind of war weariness.
But there's also pretty strong support for defending democracies, especially Taiwan. So it's not like a clear mandate either way.
No, definitely not. And you can bet an action like bombing Beijing would just pour gasoline on political polarization here.
Oh, absolutely.
You'd likely see strong support from, say, hawkish conservatives who believe in aggressive deterrence. But you'd almost certainly get fierce backlash, too, from isolationists, from many Democrats, peace activists. As the Daily Beast suggests, it would cleave the country politically.
Which would lead straight to Congress, wouldn't it? Debates over an AUMF and authorization for use of military force.
Inevitably. An AUMF is crucial. It's Congress asserting its constitutional role in declaring war, essentially giving permission for military action beyond, say, immediate self-defense.
And those debates are always intense, divisive, especially for something this monumental.
Absolutely. They'd be arguing over the scope, the duration, the very legality and wisdom of such a drastic move. And then there's the most sobering domestic risk we touched on, nuclear escalation.
Right.
If that happens, or even looks likely, the implications for disaster management, for civil defense right here in the U.S., they're profound. We'd be talking about preparations, responses, stuff we haven't seriously thought about since the Cold War ended. The potential disruption to society, infrastructure, it's almost unimaginable. Okay,
let's widen the lens again. Globally, the economic fallout, this seems massive. Taiwan makes something like 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. That's according to Axios Business Insider.
It's an incredible concentration. 90%. Think about that. Advanced chips are in everything.
Smartphones, computers, cars, medical equipment, defense systems.
Exactly. So a conflict that disrupts Taiwan, it means an almost immediate collapse of that global supply chain. We could be looking at, it sounds dramatic, but maybe a kind of technological dark age for many industries, just grinding to a halt. And it's not just the chips, right? Think broader global trade.
Yeah.
A conflict involving China, especially in that region, could very quickly lead to blockades in the South China Sea. That shuts down some of the busiest, most vital shipping lanes in the world, arteries for global commerce.
So the ripple effects just spread everywhere. Supply chains breaking down globally.
Affecting prices, availability of goods, everything, basically. An economic shockwave on an unimaginable scale.
What about allies? U.S. allies, how would they likely react to such an extreme move by the U.S., like bombing Beijing?
It's complicated. Key allies like Japan, Australia, probably NATO members too, they'd likely support sanctions against China, condemn the initial invasion if that's what happened.
But would they back direct U.S. military strikes on the Chinese capital?
That's the tricky part. Some might. But you could also see some allies, especially those, say, in Europe, with really deep economic ties to China, wanting to avoid direct military escalation.
So they might push for diplomacy. Or stick to economic pressure rather than joining military action.
Potentially, yes. It could create divisions within alliances. They'd be walking a very fine line. And we have to consider China's response globally, too. They wouldn't just sit back.
What kind of things might they do?
You'd have to anticipate major cyber attacks, targeting critical infrastructure not just in the U.S., but allies too. Financial systems, power grids, retaliation against U.S. or allied interests around the world, and a huge diplomatic push, trying to rally neutral countries or countries reliant on Chinese trade to their side, trying to isolate the U.S.
So it becomes a global geopolitical struggle, forcing countries to choose sides.
Absolutely. Countries like, say, Germany or South Korea, who depend heavily on trade with China, would face impossible choices. It could totally reshape global alliances.
Okay, so let's think about the immediate aftermath. Let's say the U.S. does strike Beijing. What happens next? The choices seem incredibly stark.
They are. Does it lead to further escalation? Do both sides move to higher nuclear readiness, closer to the brink?
Or somehow does it shock everyone into pulling back? Do they pivot towards trying to negotiate a ceasefire, trying to de-escalate from total disaster?
That's the terrifying uncertainty. And Taiwan itself is caught right in the middle.
What happens to Taiwan in this scenario?
I mean, the outcomes are devastating to contemplate. Its survival as a self-governing entity is obviously at stake. You'd likely see a massive humanitarian crisis, huge flows of refugees, and global public opinion would be massively impacted, probably swinging wildly depending on how events unfold and who's seen as the aggressor.
And Beijing's direct response to a strike on their capital, what would that look like?
You'd have to assume immediate retaliation. Missile strikes, potentially. Against U.S. assets, maybe allies.
And their nuclear posture.
Almost certainly a dramatic shift, perhaps moving to a higher alert status, maybe even a launch on warning posture, which is incredibly dangerous because it shortens decision times and increases the risk of miscalculation. And underpinning all of this is the immense human cost. We have to confront that.
Yeah.
The potential for civilian casualties would be staggering, not just in Taiwan, which would be the main battleground initially, but also inside China from those U.S. strikes. And we can't ignore the possibility of U.S. casualties, too.
Military personnel, obviously, but if China retaliates against the U.S. homeland or interests abroad.
Exactly. Civilian casualties potentially as well. It's
Yeah.
almost unthinkable, the scale of suffering involved. That sheer weight changes everything.
So this whole deep dive, it really brings us back to that central tension, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Trump's alleged private threat to bomb Beijing. Is it somehow a deeply risky but maybe effective way to deter Xi, playing that unpredictable madman card?
Or is it the opposite? Is it the kind of reckless talk that could actually ignite the very global conflict everyone fears, a spark in a powder keg? The risks are just immense. We've talked about them. Nuclear escalation is the ultimate fear.
Right.
But also catastrophic economic collapse, global instability on a scale we haven't seen in, well, maybe ever.
Yeah, it's definitely a scenario no one wants. We all hope it remains purely hypothetical. But, as this U.S.-China rivalry keeps getting more intense and as these kinds of alleged private threats surface, the possibility that this kind of extreme thinking gets tested, it feels like a real and, frankly, deeply worrying concern. So, thinking about everything we've just discussed, what really stands out to you, and maybe the final thought to leave you with. Do you think a threat like that, so direct, so visceral, would actually deter Xi? Or could it backfire? Could it inadvertently push him to act sooner, maybe?
Today, we're diving into something pretty heavy. A scenario that has definitely moved beyond just speculative talk.
Yeah, it's being actively studied.
Yeah.
War rooms, governments, think tanks, they're all looking at this very seriously.
Exactly. It's very real, very current. And it poses a question that, well, if it ever happened for real, it would change pretty much everything.
It redraws the map, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In ways that are almost hard to properly imagine beforehand.
So the core question we're tackling in this deep dive, what actually happens if the United States and China go to war?
Mm-hmm.
Now, almost every analysis points to Taiwan as the immediate spark, the flashpoint. And yeah, the Pacific Ocean becomes the main stage, the battleground.
Right. Geographically, that makes sense.
But we need to be really clear here. Based on everything we've looked at, if this conflict kicks off, if those first shots are fired, the entire world feels the heat. It's not contained.
Not at all. The ripple effects are global, almost instantaneous in some cases.
We've gone through quite a stack of expert sources, analyses, reports on this scenario, and honestly, it's pretty stark stuff.
It is. The picture they paint is sobering, to say the least.
So our mission today really is to explore how this potential crisis could hit home for you, how it could affect your country, your wallet, your freedom, and, our collective future. It's big picture stuff.
Absolutely. Touches everything.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. How could something this devastating even start? What's the ignition point?
Well, what's really striking, I think, is how fast things could escalate. You might think of it starting small, maybe a local incident over Taiwan.
Right, like a ship collision or something?
Maybe. But the analyses suggest it could move from that, or even start bigger, and very quickly become something that pulls everyone in, or at least forces everyone to deal with the consequences.
It's not just a theory, then. The way modern strategy and military setups work, it almost guarantees escalation.
In many ways, yes. The doctrines, the response plans, they're built for rapid reaction. And once that first shot is fired, pulling back, finding a clean exit, it becomes incredibly difficult, maybe impossible.
So, okay, the most common starting point in the sources. It seems pretty consistent, actually.
It is across the board, really.
China launches an invasion of Taiwan. The U.S. responds militarily. That's the core scenario.
That's the one that comes up again and again.
But what makes those initial moments, those first actions, so incredibly dangerous? Why do they spiral so fast? The sources lay out a few sort of interwoven triggers.
Right, and each one is potent on its own.
Yeah, like Chinese missile strikes on Taipei. And we're not just talking military targets here.
No, the analyses often include strikes on critical infrastructure, government centers, maybe even densely populated areas to cause shock. Break morale quickly.
The devastation, the immediate civilian cost would be huge, just unimaginable.
It's designed to be, to try and force a quick capitulation.
Or, okay, another trigger, out at sea. U.S. Navy ships intercepting Chinese vessels. Maybe an invasion fleet, maybe ships enforcing a blockade.
And that's not just a tense standoff anymore, that's direct military contact. Ships lives on the line in a very confined, high-stakes environment. Rules of engagement tested second by second.
Instant escalation from a crisis to actual shooting.
Exactly.
And then there's the invisible attack, cyber warfare.
Yes. Crippling the enemy before the physical fight really gets going.
The sources talk about things like taking down U.S. power grids, plunging whole regions into darkness, or hitting satellites, knocking out GPS, communications, vital military intel.
And that's not just a supporting action, that is an act of war, with immediate massive societal impact. No power, no comms, chaos.
And naturally, the U.S. wouldn't just sit back. There'd be a counterstrike.
Inevitably, U.S. strikes on Chinese military bases, airfields, ports, missile sites.
So suddenly, it's not just about Taiwan anymore. It's a direct U.S.-China fight across the whole Western Pacific.
Precisely. The key takeaway, as you said, from all the sources is, this isn't contained. It escalates. Fast, not just regional, but global.
A global crisis.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that idea of a clean exit. Once that shooting starts between the U.S. and China, it just evaporates.
Why, though? Why is it so hard to stop?
Well, think about the stakes. It's not just territory. It's national pride, decades of strategic planning, their perceived standing in the world, their credibility with allies or partners.
So neither side feels they can afford to back down easily.
Exactly. A missile strike, a ship sinking. These aren't just tactical events. They trigger this chain reaction that becomes almost impossible to control politically and militarily. We saw a quote from a military analyst in the sources that really nailed it.
What was that?
Like, once the U.S. and China exchange fire, there's no clean exit. Every major nation is forced to pick a side or suffer the fallout.
Wow. Forced to pick a side or suffer the fallout. That's dark.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is now. It's not just about formal military alliances, although those definitely matter.
Like NATO or U.S. treaties with Japan and South Korea.
Right. But it's also the economy. The deep financial ties, the supply chains, the strategic dependencies that have built up over decades.
So the moment the two biggest players economically, militarily, start fighting, everyone else is immediately caught in the crossfire.
They face this awful choice. Side with one, risk the anger and retaliation of the other economic punishment, maybe worse. Or try stay neutral.
Which sounds sensible.
But maybe isn't possible. How do you stay neutral when the entire global system is destabilized? When trade stops, when energy prices explode, when communication breaks down? You still suffer the consequences, massively.
So the fallout hits everyone, regardless.
That's the point. The ripple effect goes way beyond the Pacific battlegrounds. It hits global stability everywhere, forces incredibly tough decisions, causes widespread suffering. That first shot, however limited it seems initially, it sets the stage for breakdown across the board, especially the economy.
Right. And let's talk about that economic impact, because, again, the sources are pretty unanimous and, frankly, terrifying.
Yeah, terrifying is probably the right word.
They're not talking about a market correction or even just a bad recession like 2008.
No, this is different.
The language they use is more like breaking the global economy, shattering it, creating ruptures that change how global commerce works for decades.
Fundamentally restructuring it.
Yeah.
Possibly ending globalization as we know it.
And the effects would be immediate, felt everywhere, almost instantly.
That's the key, the speed and the breadth.
Okay, so let's tick through some of the big ones. Shipping halts. Across the Pacific, yes, but critically, the South China Sea.
Which is just a massive artery for global trade. Something like a third of all maritime trade goes through there. Trillions of dollars worth.
So imagine that just stops, cut off.
The impact is almost unimaginable. Store shelves empty remarkably fast. Factories grind to a halt.
Then the tech collapse. This one seems huge. Taiwan,
the flashpoint itself.
Supplying over 60% of the world's semiconductors, and even more, like 90% of the really advanced ones.
The cutting-edge chips, yes. The ones that power everything from AI to advanced weapons to smartphones.
So if that supply just vanishes overnight,
it triggers a crisis in literally almost every industry that uses electronics, which is almost every industry.
And energy markets, oil and gas prices. The sources suggest they could shoot past $200 a barrel.
Easily, maybe higher. War disrupts supply. Insurance rates for tankers skyrocket. Key routes become impassable.
And $200 oil, that ripples through everything too, right? Transport, manufacturing, food.
Everything. It fuels massive inflation, makes production costs soar, puts immense strain on consumers and businesses.
So the combined effect, it's not just recession, it could be a global depression, something maybe worse than the 1930s.
That's certainly what some analyses suggest is possible, a complete collapse of the current economic order.
And this isn't abstract Wall Street stuff. This hits people directly, U.S. consumers, for example.
No, absolutely. If we want to bring it back to that bigger picture connection, this shows just how fragile that interconnected global economy is. A conflict over there immediately impacts your life over here.
So let's dig into that. Those shipping lanes, the South China Sea. Why is halting traffic there so catastrophic? It's not just delays.
No, it's far beyond delays. Think about just-in-time manufacturing. That's how so much of the world works now. Lean supply chains, minimal inventory.
Relying on parts arriving exactly when needed.
Precisely. So if that flow stops, particularly at major choke points like the Strait of Malacca or through the South China Sea, it's not a hiccup. It's like inducing a heart attack in the global manufacturing system.
Factories just stop working.
Within days, potentially. Cars, electronics, pharmaceuticals, you name it. They run out of essential components coming from Asia. Raw materials stop moving to ores. Minerals needed for everything. Finished goods can't get out. It's paralysis. Empty shelves wouldn't be temporary. It could last months, even years, depending on how long the conflict lasts and how damaged the infrastructure gets.
Okay, and the tech collapse. Taiwan's semiconductors. You mentioned TSMC. Why is it so irreplaceable, really? Can't other companies just step up?
Not quickly, and maybe not at all for the most advanced chips. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, has perfected incredibly complex manufacturing processes over decades, building new fabs, these fabrication plants, capable of making those cutting-edge chips.
Takes time and money.
A huge amount of both. Years, easily, and tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars per fab. And there's no guarantee you can replicate their expertise immediately. So, losing TSMC isn't just losing volume, it's losing access to the most critical technology powering the modern world.
So it's not just my phone or laptop getting more expensive or hard to find.
Oh, much bigger than that. Think military hardware guidance systems, drones, communications. Think medical equipment, MRI machines, life support systems. Think data centers that run the cloud and AI. Think automotive modern cars are packed with advanced chips. Think critical infrastructure control systems.
Everything grinds to a halt or degrades significantly.
It's like a forced de-digitization, a massive blow to productivity, innovation, and even national security across the globe. A crisis for basically every industry that plugs into a wall.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
And the $200 oil cascade effects?
Yeah, it's brutal. Higher fuel costs hit transportation immediately. Trucks, ships, trains, everything needed to move goods gets vastly more expensive. That feeds directly into inflation for consumers.
Makes everything cost more.
Exactly. Then manufacturing energy is a huge input cost. So factories that can still get parts face soaring energy bills, pushing prices up further or forcing shutdowns. And food. This is critical.
How so?
Modern agriculture is incredibly energy intensive. Diesel for tractors, harvesters, transport. Natural gas is essential for making nitrogen fertilizers. Sky-high energy prices mean farmers can't afford to operate or fertilize properly. That leads to lower yields, higher food prices, and potentially real food shortages, especially impacting poorer nations, but felt everywhere. Just the cost of living becomes unbearable for millions.
And for U.S. consumers specifically, paint that picture.
Okay, immediate, massive inflation. Your dollar buys significantly less. Groceries, gas, rent, everything skyrockets. Budgets are stretched thin or just break.
So a huge drop in living standards.
Definitely. Then supply chains freezing, not just slowing down, freezing. Goods from overseas, especially China, just stop arriving. Think about how much stuff in your house comes from China.
Phones, clothes, electronics, appliances, toys, a lot.
A huge amount. that flow stops. So widespread scarcity, things you take for granted are suddenly unavailable or maybe available at extortionate prices if they can be sourced elsewhere. It's like turning the clock back decades on material availability.
Okay, and what about developing nations? You mentioned food shortages.
It's catastrophic for them, truly. Widespread famine is a real possibility in vulnerable regions. Global food supply chains break, prices become unaffordable. On top of that, international aid, like from the IMF or World Bank,
Dries up.
likely. Donor countries are facing their own massive economic crises. They'll redirect funds inwards. So for developing nations, it's a perfect storm. No food, no aid, unaffordable energy, collapsing export markets. Millions, potentially tens or hundreds of millions, pushed back into extreme poverty. Decades of progress just wiped out.
Leading to?
Massive social unrest, government collapse, internal conflicts, desperate mass migration, an unprecedented global humanitarian crisis.
It's a bleak picture, and from that visible economic ruin, we shift to something unseen: cyber warfare.
Silent battlefield, yeah. But potentially just as devastating.
Because this wouldn't just be ships and planes, the sources are clear. This would be the first truly global cyber war, fought online, but with brutal, real-world effects.
And both sides have poured enormous resources into developing these capabilities for years. It's not science fiction.
So what are we talking about? What kind of attacks?
Crippling civilian infrastructure is key. Taking down the U.S. power grid, for instance. Not just flickering lights, inane blackouts across large areas.
Affecting homes, hospitals, water treatment, everything.
Everything. Imagine the chaos. Hospitals relying on backup generators that eventually run out of fuel. No running water or sanitation in cities. No heating or cooling. It's a public health nightmare waiting to happen.
And banks, financial systems.
Shutting down banks. Freezing transactions. Your credit cards don't work. ATMs are down. You can't access your money. That paralyzes the economy instantly and causes widespread panic.
GPS systems, satellites.
Taking out GPS would cripple navigation, civilian and military. It affects everything from shipping logistics to farming to how emergency services operate. Jamming or destroying satellites could blind intelligence gathering, knock out communications, weather forecasting, even TV broadcasts. Widespread internet blackouts are also a major possibility.
Cutting off communication, commerce, isolating people and nations.
Exactly. And it wouldn't be one-way traffic. Chinese hackers hitting U.S. hospitals, transport networks. Imagine the chaos if air traffic control or railway systems go down.
Paralyzing essential services, causing direct harm.
Right. And then U.S. retaliation, hitting Chinese communication networks, their surveillance state infrastructure, becomes this escalating digital fight with devastating real-world consequences everywhere.
It really makes you ask, how does a modern society function if that digital backbone is just cut?
That's the terrifying question, isn't it? And cyber warfare is different. It can be launched from anywhere, penetrate deep inside a country without a physical invasion, and the targets are often deliberately civilian to cause maximum panic and breakdown.
Plus, it's hard to know exactly who did what, right? Attribution.
Notoriously difficult. Which adds another layer of danger miscalculation, hitting back at the wrong target, or escalating because you think you know who attacked you.
Let's just linger on those infrastructure blackouts for a moment. Power grids down. It's more than just inconvenience, isn't it?
Oh, profoundly more. No lights is the least of it. No heating in winter. No cooling in summer. Food spoils. Medicines that need refrigeration are lost. Water pumps stop. No running water. No sanitation. Communication networks fail. Traffic lights go out. Public transport stops. It's a rapid descent into a struggle for basic survival for millions. Public health crises. Civil disorder. It's grim.
And banks shutting down. The entire economy just freezes.
Pretty much. Salaries can't be paid electronically. Bills can't be paid. People can't buy essentials. Trade stops. The digital money we rely on just isn't accessible. Panic, desperation, potential runs on banks if they can even open physically.
And losing GPS, satellites, the internet.
Yeah.
We don't even realize how much depends on them.
We really don't. GPS is embedded in so much logistics, timing for power grids and financial networks, farming, construction, not just the map on your phone. Losing it throws countless systems into chaos. Satellites are our eyes and ears for weather, intelligence, communication. Without them, we're partially blind and deaf globally. And the internet, well, imagine society without it. No email, no websites, no online banking or shopping. Many communication platforms gone. Emergency services rely on it. Supply chains rely on it. It's fundamental.
It's genuinely unnerving how dependent, how vulnerable we've become.
It is.
And the sources specifically call out hospitals and transport systems as targets. That feels particularly brutal.
It is, and it creates an immediate humanitarian crisis within the war zone and potentially far beyond. Hitting hospitals means disabling patient records, life support, diagnostic machines. Imagine trying to run a hospital during a war and a cyber attack. Could lead to mass casualties from treatable conditions.
And transport systems.
Paralyzing air traffic control, railways, ports. That stops the movement of essential goods. Food, medicine, fuel, and emergency personnel right when they're needed most. It cripples the ability to respond to the crisis. Remember that expert quote?
It would be chaos one.
Yeah. Millions could lose power, communication, even water. It's not sci-fi. It's day one of a cyber war. That's not hype. It's a sober assessment of the immediate damage potential.
Day one. Okay. And as all this is happening, the shooting, the economic collapse, the cyber attacks, the rest of the world isn't just watching, are they?
No. As that analyst said, you're forced to pick a side or suffer. Neutrality becomes almost impossible when the two biggest powers are at war.
So this forces a global division. How do the sources see that shaking out? Who sides with whom?
Well, the predictions are fairly consistent based on existing alliances and interests. Supporting the U.S., you'd likely see its core treaty allies stepping up.
Japan, Australia.
Definitely. Given their location and security ties, the UK, France, other key NATO allies would likely provide support, maybe military, certainly logistical and political. India is often mentioned as offering diplomatic support, maybe intelligence sharing, but likely trying to avoid direct military involvement given its own complex neighborhood.
Okay. And on China's side?
Russia is seen as the primary backer, deepening their no-limits partnership against perceived U.S. influence. Iran, North Korea, nations already at odds with the U.S. would likely see an opportunity and align with China, perhaps providing resources or creating distractions.
And then there are countries economically tied to China, Africa, South Asia.
That's a huge factor. The Belt and Road Initiative, massive trade dependencies. These countries would be under immense pressure, even if they want to stay neutral. Their economic lifeline might effectively pull them towards China's orbit, or at least prevent them from openly opposing Beijing. It's less about ideology and more about economic survival for many.
So it's not just redrawing maps, it's reshaping the entire global power structure for potentially generations.
That's exactly the implication. Let's look at why. For Japan and Australia, it's straightforward. Defense treaties with the U.S. shared concerns about China's military expansion right in their backyard. Their economies are tied to the U.S.-led system.
Makes sense. UK, France, NATO.
Shared democratic values, yes, but also deep military integration with the U.S. through NATO. A conflict like this is a fundamental challenge to the international order they've helped build and benefit from. They have global interests, too.
And India's caution.
Strategic ties with the U.S. are growing, definitely, and they have major border issues and strategic competition with China. But India also values its strategic autonomy, has historical ties with Russia, a key arms supplier, and wants to avoid being drawn into a direct superpower conflict if possible. So, likely support, but perhaps measured. Now, China's partners. Russia sees it as a strategic necessity countering NATO, challenging U.S. dominance. They've been increasing military coordination for years. For Iran and North Korea, it's opportunistic. Anything that weakens the U.S. helps them pursue their own regional goals and reduces the pressure on them. They might offer asymmetric support drones, missiles, cyber capabilities.
And the economic leverage China has.
It's immense. Through Belt and Road, China has become the largest trading partner and lender for many nations in Africa, Asia, even Latin America. Infrastructure projects create dependency. These countries might face a devastating choice: alienate their main economic patron or risk Western sanctions and diplomatic isolation. They're truly caught.
So what about everyone else? The countries desperately trying not to choose.
They face a nightmare scenario. First, potentially massive refugee waves. Not just from Taiwan, but maybe coastal China, maybe other conflict zones. Millions fleeing, overwhelming neighboring countries' resources, creating huge instability. Think Syria, but potentially on a much larger scale across Asia.
Humanitarian capacity just breaks.
Completely. Then, currency shocks. Global finance convulses. Capital flees to perceived safe havens, like the U.S. dollar, ironically, or gold. Local currencies in developing nations collapse, making imports impossible to afford.
Fuel shortages.
Crippling. With shipping disrupted and prices at $200 plus a barrel, many countries simply couldn't afford fuel for transport, electricity, anything. Economies grind to a halt. famine risk increases dramatically.
And intense pressure to pick a side anyway.
Constant diplomatic and economic pressure from both Washington and Beijing. You're either with us or against us becomes a harsh reality. Trying to stay neutral might mean losing aid, facing sanctions, or even becoming a proxy battleground. Neutrality becomes a very costly, perhaps unsustainable position.
This leads us, I guess, to the darkest part, the human cost and the nuclear risk.
Yeah, this is the element that hangs over everything. The sources are very clear. This isn't a conventional war where nuclear escalation is off the table. It's a real, terrifying possibility.
Why specifically this conflict?
Because both the US and China are nuclear powers with sophisticated arsenals. Both have intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that can reach each other's territory.
Mutually assured destruction, basically.
In theory. They also both have nuclear-armed submarines hiding in the oceans, guaranteeing a devastating retaliatory strike. But here's the really scary part mentioned in the sources.
The first use capability.
Exactly. Both nations, unlike some others, reserve the right to use nuclear weapons first if they believe their homeland, their core territory, or their regime's survival is under existential threat.
So they don't have to wait to be nuked themselves.
Correct. If one side feels it's facing catastrophic conventional defeat or its command structure is about to be wiped out, the temptation, the doctrine, allows for initiating nuclear use to try and stave off that defeat. That lowers the threshold significantly compared to a strict no first use policy. It makes the unthinkable suddenly thinkable in the heat of a desperate conflict.
And that just raises the question, what happens when those global safety nets, the things designed to handle disasters, are just completely swamped, not just economically, but by the sheer human suffering?
Well, that first use capability is key to why this conflict is seen as uniquely dangerous from a nuclear perspective. It creates extreme instability. A misinterpretation of radar signals, a desperate gamble by a losing side, a breakdown in communication.
Yeah.
Any could potentially trigger escalation. Amendment is supposed to deter, but in the fog and chaos of a massive war, the controls could fail.
It's genuinely chilling. But even if, and it feels like a huge if, even if nukes aren't used, the conventional war itself sounds apocalyptic.
Absolutely horrific. The scale of conventional death and destruction will likely dwarf anything seen since World War II. We're talking massive military casualties on land, at sea, in the air, but also inevitably a terrible toll on civilians.
Taiwan itself
would be devastated. Cities potentially leveled by bombardment and urban warfare. Infrastructure destroyed. A humanitarian catastrophe on the island itself.
And beyond Taiwan.
Coastal cities could become targets. Military bases, ports, industrial centers in China, potentially in the US, or allied nations like Japan or Guam. Bombing campaigns to cripple warfighting ability would cause immense collateral damage. Millions would be displaced, fleeing the fighting, creating internal and external refugee crises on a scale we can barely comprehend.
So the humanitarian collapse you mentioned earlier, it follows inevitably.
Yes, that refugee crisis across Asia. Millions needing food, water, shelter, medical care. Neighboring countries completely overwhelmed. International aid organizations like the Red Cross or UN agencies.
Swamped, utterly insufficient.
Their resources are designed for localized disasters or regional conflicts, not a globe-spanning war between superpowers that shatters supply chains and paralyzes transport. They simply couldn't cope. We'd see widespread shortages of everything. Medicine, leading to deaths from otherwise treatable conditions. Food, leading to famine. Clean water, shelter, basic sanitation, leading to disease outbreaks. It's a picture of societal breakdown on an almost unimaginable scale.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, and it's deeply sobering, from the initial sparks over Taiwan escalating rapidly into a global crisis.
Right, through the shattering of the global economy, trade, tech, energy.
To the invisible war fought in cyberspace, crippling infrastructure.
And the fracturing of the world into hostile camps, immense pressure on everyone.
And finally, confronting that ultimate shadow, the nuclear risk and the catastrophic cost even of a conventional war.
Yeah.
So the final question, I guess, is what does a world look like after something like this, if there's an after?
The sources sketch out a few possibilities, none of them good.
Like a permanently fractured world economy, split into two rival blocks, maybe a US-Europe-led one and a China-Russia-led one. Separate supply chains, no more real globalization.
That's a strong possibility. Economic balkanization, yeah. Where you trade, who you invest with, depends entirely on which geopolitical camp you're in.
And military rivalry hardening. NATO versus BRICS, maybe, becoming actual armed camps. A new Cold War, but maybe hotter and less stable.
Very possible. More explicit military competition, higher defense spending globally, constant tension.
What about China itself? Does it come out weaker or stronger?
Depends on the outcome, obviously. A costly stalemate or defeat could cripple its economy and global ambitions for decades. But if it achieves its core objectives, say taking Taiwan, even at horrific cost, it might emerge emboldened, convinced its time has come, trying to impose a new world order.
And U.S. leadership.
Also question, potentially. The cost in blood and treasure would be immense. Allies might be devastated. Win or lose, America's position would be debated, potentially diminished, or perhaps reconfirmed as the leader of its bloc, but in a much more dangerous, fragmented world.
But regardless of who wins, the baseline cost is just staggering loss of life, destruction, and a collapse of global trust.
That seems unavoidable in almost any scenario short of immediate de-escalation, which we've established is difficult. The loss of life, infrastructure, economic capacity, and just the basic trust between nations needed for cooperation. It would take generations to recover, if ever.
Or, the worst case, this isn't the end, it's the beginning of World War III.
That's the ultimate nightmare scenario raised by the sources. A conflict that draws in more and more powers, potentially goes nuclear, and fundamentally threatens human civilization itself.
Wow, this deep dive. It really just hammers home how fragile things are, doesn't it? Global peace, the systems we rely on, and how something seemingly far away could impact literally every single person on the planet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not abstract. Military action connects directly to your wallet.
Yeah.
Cyber attacks connect directly to your daily life. Alliance shifts connect directly to global stability. It's all interwoven.
It is sobering.
And it serves as a powerful reminder, I think. The saying, great wars often start from small sparks. Miscalculations, incidents that spiral.
Yeah.
Understanding these dynamics, the potential pathways to conflict, the sheer catastrophic cost. It isn't about fear-mongering. It's about awareness. It's about recognizing the critical importance of diplomacy, of de-escalation, of finding off-ramps before the shooting starts. Because once it does, as we've seen today, stopping it becomes terrifyingly difficult.
It really challenges you to think about that interconnectedness and the responsibility maybe that comes with it. How do we prevent the unthinkable?